Hello, and thanks for joining today's webinar with the Real Story Group, and welcome to our first presentation of the year 2020. We're going to be kicking off a number of webinars over the next few weeks where we talk about different marketplace trends, and today we're going to focus on the CDP marketplace. My name is Scott Dill. I'm in the sales team here with Real Story Group, and our founder, Tony Byrne, will be on the line momentarily to take us through the heart of today's presentation. But as we get started, I just wanted to make a couple of quick points. First and foremost, if you have questions, we will have a couple minutes at the end. So please feel free to enter those into the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. I noticed that there are some subscribers on the line, so you'll have access to a recording of today's presentation in your subscriber library, and certainly we appreciate you being loyal customers. And for those that are new to us, welcome. Thanks for joining today's presentation. And we certainly hope you get some value out of it. And we will be sending the slides to you as well within the next couple of days. So keep an eye out for that. As we get started, just want to mention a couple of things about Real Story Group. We are an analyst firm, and where we're unique in the industry is in a couple of different ways. First and foremost is our coverage areas. We are completely focused on what we call the Omnichannel technology space, or other folks refer to it as the MarTech space. And the map that you see here is a good outline of the different vendors we cover in these different markets. So we break it down into areas like web content management, digital asset management, and you'll see there is overlap with a number of these vendors that are playing in these different spaces. But there are also, of course, some best-in-breed solutions that are on the more outside or periphery of the map. Today, we're going to be focused on the orange line, which is our customer data platform research. And so I'm going to turn things over to Tony to really dive into that and what we're seeing in the CDP marketplace. So, Tony?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Scott. We're going to be doing some future gazing here, but first I thought I'd talk a little bit about the past, sort of where we're coming from Real Story Group. I founded the company in 2001, basically in reaction to this quadrant you see on the left here, this idea that you could fix vendors in space and that some were good and some were generically bad. I was a customer of this kind of analyst research, and quite frankly found it shallow and trite and not very technical. And I thought there had to be a better way to tell the real story about what's going on in these different marketplaces and what are the true weaknesses and strengths of different vendors. And this idea that really, if you're looking, for example, at CDP technology, you shouldn't necessarily look for the quote unquote best CDP, but what you really want is the best fitting CDP. And so to do that, we figured out very early on that we had to be completely independent by only working for you, the technology customer, and never advising vendors. So we don't consult to them, we don't speak at our events, we don't accept junkets from them, we don't write white papers from them, they can't quote us in their press releases. We only work for you, the enterprise customer. And as a result, I think you'll see over the course of the next half hour that our research and analysis is quite original and also probably the most hard-hitting that you'll see out there. So let's talk about CDP and CDP trends for the 2020s. I think we really need to take a step back and look at what's the overall context here. And I think as we look at customer engagement more broadly in the 2020s, of course, you've got all these different channels now where you're trying to contextualize and assemble experiences for your customers, ideally in a coherent way. And so I think it's fair to say that what we all want to do is get the right content and message to the right person in the right context at the right time, and then measure the effectiveness, right? And we need to do this obviously through engagement channels. So I think we're in agreement about kind of where we need to go. The question is, how do we get there? And one of the fundamental problems right now with the stacks that we developed over the 2010s is that we have this siloed problem, where you have isolated, disjointed, inconsistent customer experiences where someone might click on an ad, get excited, go to your website, get all confused, but then get an email from you that excites you, tries to click through on their mobile device, has a bad experience, complains on social, gets a nice response, then gets a print piece in the mail that confuses them. They try asking a question on Alexa, get a decent answer, but then end up at your chatbot, and that's not a good experience. And finally, they may get face to face with someone, perhaps in a store or a distributor or something, and have a good experience. And so, this is not the way we want it to go. But one of the problems here, I think probably the major problem, is that each one of these silos tends to have its own content data, its own rules, its own planning, and then its own analytics. And integrating all these things laterally becomes nearly impossible. So our sense for this is that what the service model is going to look like for an integrated customer experience is going to be very different in the future. Yes, you'll have these channels where you have contextual engagement, but you're going to need these foundational services around data, orchestration, content in red, intelligence here in blue, and then omnichannel operations in green. And there's a reason why we have orange here at the top, because unified customer data is really foundational. You've got to get that house at least somewhat in order if you want to do all of these other sorts of things and have an integrated customer experience. You've got to have unified customer data that's available in a consistent way to all of these different channels, right? So that's really what we're talking about today. And so the first trend I think that we'd see about CDP is that while the technology is interesting and useful to look at in itself, what we're seeing is savvy stack owners sort of looking at this in the context of a broader reference architecture model for the 2020s. It's really focused on these enterprise foundation services that you see down here, the purple, the red, the orange, and the green, all then pushing foundational data, content, and decisions up to these content and engagement management services like CRM, social, email, web content management, and so forth. So those are still obviously important systems, but increasingly we're looking at investments in these enterprise foundation services, and data is probably first and foremost among those. So CDPs really need to be seen in the context of a broader environment. And what this also suggests is that you really don't want to look at CDPs in a vacuum, right? That one of the things, for example, that we find is that among our larger subscribers, when they start investing in unifying their customer data, they then start thinking about, okay, what am I going to do with this? And it naturally takes them to places like omnichannel operations, journey orchestration, and then ultimately having some sort of omnichannel content story as well. So these boxes are related to each other. So that's the first trend, is to really look at this in context. I think the second trend that already was happening in 2019 and we're really seeing it in 2020, and quite honestly, we have kind of mixed feelings about this, but we're seeing a widening in the CDP use cases. So these are the 9 business use cases that we use to evaluate CDP vendors. So we always look at business scenarios and use cases as the primary way to distinguish among different vendors and evaluate what they're good at and what they're not good at. And what's interesting about this has been just the expansion over the past couple of years of the sorts of use cases that CDPs are trying to tackle here. Now, the reality is that no single vendor is going to be good at more than 3 or 4 of these. So it becomes really important for you to prioritize what is it that we're trying to get out of this platform. I'll just highlight a couple of here that have been particularly interesting and maybe even a little bit surprising. One is advanced customer data management, like really focusing a lot on the data management at a time when many CDP vendors are focused on engagement, and so that's a key differentiator. The other one that's become hot is B2B support. This is a space that kind of came out of the B2C arena originally, but we're seeing a lot of interest among particularly larger B2B suppliers. And the other one that's really quite interesting is predictive analytics, which is nominally something that maybe is already happening as far as your enterprise analytics efforts, but it's interesting to see this kind of more democratic marketing forward use cases where you have more analytics kind of happening a little bit at the edge. Then the last one that's interesting here is, of course, supporting digital advertising services, which is nominally something in the past that maybe you might have used a DMP or a data management platform for. But as the world really kind of shifts from third-party data to first-party data, we're seeing a lot of uses around first-party data in connection with ad, particularly retargeting. And so CDPs are playing an increasingly important role in many enterprise sort of ad campaigns. What's interesting still, of course, is again what we're seeing, this trend broadening. And another use case, we're going to actually add a 10th use case. We're in the process of doing that right now to all of our vendors, which is loyalty and rewards management, which is really interesting. Again, this is an area where there's a lot of vendors who do this, but we're seeing CDPs sort of playing a central role in this for obvious reasons, particularly because in many cases, loyalty and rewards touch a number of different front-end engagement systems. And so having a single back-end repository of customer data that's really focused on this is important. As it happens, of the 30 CDP vendors that we evaluate, only 4 or 5 of them are really active in this, but I think we'll see more and more there. So clearly the scope for this, when you're starting to unify customer data, the scope for the business applications that ride on top of that is definitely getting wider. So there's a related trend, number 3, is that CDPs are everywhere. And by saying this, what I mean is that there are a lot of other vendors who claim to also provide customer data platform services or some sort of embedded customer data mart. So here's an example from a journey orchestration engine platform from Infor that also wraps with some segmentation capabilities that you use explicitly in the same interface, right? So you have your customer data, and then you develop segments, and then you define, okay, what are the different rules and decisions that you're going to do with these different segments, all within the same interface. There's a certain degree of convenience for that. On the other hand, do you really want your CDP to be completely bound to your journey orchestration engine? Probably not. Now, to Infor's credit, they don't claim that this is a pro forma CDP, but the reality is that they are actually performing kind of CDP style services here. And in an ideal world, you wouldn't have 2 of these. And I think this is part of really a broader issue, that there's a number of other vendors who are trying to provide your definitive source of customer data. And by definition, if they do something else, then they're probably not the place that you want to do this. So you see, DMPs in the advertising space trying to be your CDP for a long time, particularly in the B2B environment. We saw CRM vendors claiming that they could be your CDP. Not a good place to do it. Certainly email and marketing automation historically was kind of a marketing data warehouse. Now we know that we don't want to have all of that data stuck in that channel. Among major WCM or so-called digital experience platforms, or DXPs, very often are now trying to, in the service of supporting web personalization, also be your definitive source of customer data. I can tell you, you absolutely do not want to do this. Even though major analyst firms like Forrester and Gartner are encouraging you to do this, you definitely do not want to do that. You definitely want to keep your customer data separate and at a lower level in your stack so it can work with all of your different engagement channels in a coherent way. And then likewise for journey orchestration, which we just talked about, and certainly in terms of your analytics hubs, you probably want to use those more for intelligence rather than real-time sort of engagement. Is not necessarily something that like a data lake or a data warehouse is designed to do. So really, if you're looking at building some sort of a customer data mart, either homegrown or from a licensed tool, get it from a solution that actually supports that directly, rather than a CDP kind of being an add-on, which then locks your customer data into a particular channel. So the 4th trend is really about the marketplace, and what we'll see in 2020 is the marketplace likely to become, or I would say to remain, highly fragmented. So fragmented is analyst speak for there are a heck of a lot of CDP vendors out there in the world, and we tend to put them into 2 categories. You've got suite vendors over on the left, from large MarTech and CX vendors, IBM having sold off its portfolio to Acoustic, and then a whole set of pure play platforms, of which, by the way, more are joining with every quarter. We've certainly been adding more. There's been close to $1 billion in investment money going into these platforms over the past several years. And so there's an enormous amount of activity and uptake among the pure play vendors. So this is not an unusual breakdown for a young marketplace. So young marketplaces tend to divide between traditional suite vendors and pure play platforms. And then over time, it shifts and becomes more of a complexity spectrum. We're not quite there yet, There's still a lot of jockeying and shifting among all these different tools. In general, almost all these vendors are growing and doing well, so it's kind of tough to tell, which ones are going to be long-term survivors. It could be that most or all of them are, and so we're going to talk about that in terms of an overall trend. But I think that the marketplace is going to remain fragmented in 2020. It's likely to remain fragmented, quite honestly, for the next several years. So we tend to focus a little bit less on vendor viability risk, although clearly it's there. Big vendors can also make quick shifts. Big vendors can also do acquisitions. So, there will be some turbulence in this marketplace, but it could be that 2 or 3 years from now, it doesn't look too much different than this. Let's talk a little bit about what's going on, certainly with the major suite vendors. We're in the process of updating our evaluations of all of these vendors. Really interesting to look at this. Microsoft, Adobe, Salesforce, SAP, Oracle, all announcing within the past 6 months pro forma CDP offerings. What's interesting about this, these are relative newcomers, which means although the vendors have been around for a while, so our CDP technologies are still somewhat immature and really just kind of coming out of beta. So you've got to be careful about that. The other thing that we saw is that the initial use cases for these is really around unifying customer data within their own silos, right? So Adobe is very focused on providing customer data to other Adobe platforms. Microsoft is explicitly targeting just Dynamics CRM and Dynamics Marketing for its CDP as well. So to that extent, they're really kind of surprisingly parochial and not necessarily yet looking at CDP as a broader kind of platform. They're talking about playing nicely with each other, but there's little evidence of that to date. And the other thing that's interesting about these is that they typically require licensing multiple pieces from this particular vendor. So it's not like you just buy CDP as a unique offering. They're often bound to other tools, including in some cases some engagement tools. So it's a little bit messy architecturally. So certainly you want to potentially explore these tools, but don't default to Adobe or SAP or Microsoft just because you already have a license with them. Don't default to their CDP out of hand. You definitely want to compare it and contrast it with some of the pure play vendors, which of course there are many, many of these. So here, the questions of immaturity are less about the technology itself, because in many cases, these tools have been around for 3, 4, 5, in some cases 6 or 7 years. The issue is really more that the vendors themselves are a little bit smaller, certainly some immaturity in terms of things like ecosystems and partner ecosystems in particular. We're seeing greater specialization, which is interesting for you, either specializing in a particular region, particular customer size, or a particular industry vertical, which may have some promise for you. Many of these vendors are also expanding into adjacent areas. We certainly would wish that they wouldn't on behalf of larger enterprises that might want this to be a little bit cleaner. So this is understandable, but something for you to sort of be aware of. Do I really want to get journey orchestration services, for example, from my CDP vendor? Probably not. Generally speaking, these vendors are richly funded and continue to raise more money. So that's why we really don't see a lot of marketplace consolidation happening in the near term. There could be some acquisitions. It's possible there could be some mergers, although for a variety of reasons that could be difficult in this space. It's possible that some of these might become so-called undead, which means they're chugging along but not really growing. There's certainly worse things that could happen to you. So in general, we see overall a kind of stability in this marketplace, and probably, if anything, rather than significant exits from this marketplace, probably more significant entrance into this marketplace over the next year or two. So this just gets at the point that I was making earlier about the still somewhat lingering maturity or immaturity in this marketplace, which is, if we look at, this is Real Story Group's Real Quadrant Generator. And so what this does is, you can, by the way, try this for free on our site. The idea here is that you can plug in the strategic considerations that are important for you, and that's the y-axis, and then the scenarios that are important for you, and that's the x-axis. And if we take a generic basket of scenarios and then we crank this out for the CDP vendors, this tends to be somewhat of a saggy group. In other words, they tend to, you see that the majority of vendors are below the mean here on the y-axis. And what this means is that in terms of strategic considerations, things like roadmap maturity, channel maturity, ecosystem maturity, these vendors have a lot of ways to go. I mean, even Microsoft, the ecosystem around their new CDP is almost non-existent right now. And so the reality is that this is still a somewhat immature space and is likely to remain so for the next year. And so that's just something to keep in mind. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't necessarily license these tools. There's obviously all of these vendors can point to happy customers, but you have to definitely, do the traditional sorts of mitigation that you do when you're working with a young marketplace. So I'll just reiterate what Scott said, which is if you have any questions or comments or anything that you'd like us to address that you didn't hear here, feel free to use the questions tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. So if you're looking at this huge fractured marketplace and you're like, okay, how do I get there? We definitely encourage you to set aside your old waterfall style thinking around selecting technology with these long spreadsheets of feature-based requirements. It never works and is very outdated for this world. Is that you really want to apply more modern design thinking. My colleague Jared Dingers and I wrote a book about this called The Right Way to Select Technology, a much more agile approach where you put together a team, you test, you iterate against your requirements, which should be very use case, and then sort of adapt the process so you get hands-on with the technology. It can be a little bit tricky getting hands-on with a CDP, but it can be done if you prepare properly, and so you definitely want to try before you buy. Okay, the last trend I'm going to talk about is business focus, and this is a really important trend, for 2020. Is that I think that we've gotten beyond the excitement phase for CDPs, and now we need to ask ourselves, okay, what are we going to do with this? Now, here's the famous Gartner hype chart. And like many of you, I have kind of a love-hate relationship with this chart. On the one hand, I think Gartner did, in theory, capture some of the hype cycle that does happen around new technologies. On the other hand, like many Gartner visuals and concepts, it's highly static, right? So it's this idea that all these tools always go through the same cycle, and that there's this definitive way that these things sort of happen. And the reality is a lot more complicated than that. But what I would say here, and obviously the reason why I bring this is because you can see customer data platforms are still in this so-called peak of inflated expectations. And that may or may not be true. This has caused a lot of consternation out there in the world. And I think the way to think about this is less, where is this technology on somebody's hype cycle, and more, where are you? What is your degree of readiness? What are the challenges that you would have to address, and what are the opportunities that you foresee? And then really take a hard look at your own internal capacity and readiness for this technology. And I think that some of you might be here, that you're still thinking about it as something innovative. And so that's a good time to get educated and to learn about the possibilities, perhaps talk to some of your peers, certainly talk to us. A number of our council members are using CDPs, and so definitely Real Story Group can be a resource to you if you're a stack owner wondering about this. Some of you are really, really excited about this and ready to go. You're totally on board. You love the idea of this. You see desperate problems you want to solve. And so at that point, I would say that excitement is well placed, but you also then have to take a hard look at your readiness. Do you have the right data? Would you be able to clean it, to connect it, to then deploy it? So you've got to really take a hard look at your own level of capacity to exploit these tools if you're really excited about it. Some of you have looked at this technology, maybe even trialed this technology, and it hasn't gone well. And we know that, having talked to some of you who did this. And so I think there what you want to do is sort of draw the lessons, like, okay, it worked for some other customers, but it didn't work for us. Why is that? And it could be that you had the wrong fitting vendor, which is always a tragedy in my mind, since as a company, Real Story Group is always focused on getting you to the right fitting vendor, but it happens. In other cases, you simply weren't ready to deploy for a variety of different reasons. And then some of you have deployed CDPs and are quite and are getting value from it and are ready to get more value from it. And so The question here is not where is customer data platforms on some generic hype chart, but really, I think the trend for if anything, for 2020 is for organizations to really look at their own business readiness, their own business capacity, and what is the potential opportunity here, and what resources do they have to align against that opportunity to make sure that they're successful in this deployment. So here's the key takeaways from the last half hour or so. First, CDPs, whether they're your package or it's a homegrown data mart that you want to build, they're increasingly foundation to a truly omni-channel stack strategy, right? Like, so we put data first. You've got to get the data part right, then you get the decisions, content, operations, that can then drive a truly customer-centric experience. There are many, many different use cases. We evaluate vendors now against 10 of them, so you'll definitely want to prioritize what's important for you as you go look at this technology. Avoid building definitive customer data marts and other package platforms, and other vendors will encourage you to do this. It's just a bad idea. In an ideal architecture, you have a CDP that has the authoritative marketing and customer engagement data that you can then feed, and segments that you can feed to other packages. You have a lot of choices. You are likely to continue to have a lot of choices, both from large vendors who are starting to play, but still kind of continue to lag, as well as a whole slew of, in some cases, very impressive pure play independent CDP providers. 6, you want to definitely assess your business readiness in 2020. Where are you in terms of your ability to address the inevitable data management challenges and data integration challenges that come up with any CDP implementation, as well as to exploit the potential opportunities here. As you look to select these technologies, definitely try before you buy, even if that takes a little bit of work. You don't want to get stuck with a poor fitting CDP because it just takes a lot of work to undo it and get to the right place. So you want to employ an agile-oriented selection process that features kind of adaptive testing. Your requirements might not be perfect at first, but you can get there. Obviously, Real Story Group's research and advisory services can help you make the right decisions in terms of finding what's the right fit vendor and what's the best way to go about selecting and testing and then ultimately implementing that, ideally based on us connecting you with your peers. So in that connection, I'll talk about this person we call Stacy. Stacy is a stack owner at a large enterprise. She gets a lot of questions from her internal stakeholders. Our mission in life is to help her answer all those questions and serve as kind of a shield so that she can focus on really important things, including the long-term models and processes and future of her stack, as well as what she's going to have for lunch that day. So if that's you as a stack owner, we certainly would want to continue this conversation to see how we can make your life easier and your team more effective. So in that connection, we've got 3 different ways that we do that. First is what we call vendor selection advisory. So this is, you're looking at selecting a CDP. You can just license our CDP research and get access to us over the phone. A lot of interesting artifacts, including sample RFPs and other things, to really inform and empower your selection team with critical research and candidate advice to get you to the right decision. We've got some really interesting tools there that can help you along the way. Some larger enterprises basically license all of our research, we call the Omnichannel Stack Advisory, and then that gives us the capacity to be able to advise them on all their strategic decisions and technology choices. How does their stack up? How can we help them backfill gaps? Where are their redundancies? And we're sort of like your trusted advisor. Within that group, then some selected stack owners have joined our executive peer council, which meets 3 times a year privately for a couple days of sharing lessons, doing show and tell, learning from each other about what's working and what's not working. That's been tremendously positive. So here's how you can stay in touch with us and explore further. As Scott mentioned, the next couple of weeks also bring some new, a couple of other sort of trends webinars you want to think about with respect to digital asset management and web content management, 2 key marketplaces undergoing a lot of change. So Scott, I'll turn it over to you for a second and we'll see what questions we have.
Excellent, great, thanks Tony. I just want to reiterate too that you can try out the different tools that Tony showed on our website that will be included with the subscription. So the Real Quadrant shortlist generator, along with we have a vendor comparison tool, which is called Real Time, which if you have a CDP vendor already in-house, you can then compare that to the marketplace alternatives that are out there. Also, if you want to see a little bit more detailed overview of the subscriber experience, definitely reach out to us at explore@realstorygroup.com, and we can get that scheduled. And typically it's about a 20 to 30-minute overview of what will be available to you, and then answer questions for you as well. Would certainly encourage you to download excerpts from any or all of our research areas, and again, stay in touch with us in our upcoming webinars and our blogs that are updated very frequently. With that, Tony, any questions in the queue?
Yeah, we've got a question here around that said, you mentioned building your own customer data mart as opposed to a licensed CDP. When should I do that? And it's a great question. We tend to be biased towards packaged solutions just because historically we've found more success there. You don't really want to be in the software development business. Having said that, this is a young space. Many of you have been already kind of building towards your own custom data marts. And so there may be some value there, particularly in terms of getting through some of the messy and difficult issues of data integration, data access, data cleaning and normalization, and all the sorts of things that you often need to do in a CDP project anyway. I think I would just caution that you not necessarily commit long-term to a homegrown solution without first testing the marketplace and seeing what are some of the capabilities that you're going to get from packaged software that's being updated probably every month, and where the vendor's getting input from all their customers and is likely to have faster development cycles than you are. So you definitely, I'm not telling you to always go with the market solution or the package solution here. But if you're thinking about sort of building your own CDP or your own kind of custom customer data mart, you really should look at the marketplace first and make sure that you can't actually buy something rather than build it. So with that, we've exceeded our time just a little bit here. Wanted to thank you again for joining us today, and look forward to seeing you again, either on our site or through our LinkedIn stream or on another webinar. So for Scott Dill, this is Tony Byrne signing off until next time. Thanks again. Bye now.